Well, so we were talking about covalent bonding. So covalent bonds are the bonds which are formed due to uh, sharing of the electrons. So in covalent bonds, what happens is that two atoms try to share their electrons, and because of that sharing or that common electron, the two atoms feel as if their outermost shell is completely filled. Well, so that kind of sharing leads to formation of a covalent bond. But the interesting part of covalent bonding is that the electrons are localized in that case. The two electrons are localized in between the two atoms which are forming covalent bond. Whereas in case of ionic bond, so try to see the difference now, that in case of ionic bond, the one electron is completely transferred from that one atom to the another one. There is a complete transfer of the electron, and because of this, the atoms attain a charge, and that charge is
Sir, you are not audible.
okay. So sorry, today the interruption happened because of laptop battery. Uh, but okay, now I am online again. Hopefully things will be fine now. Am I audible there? Is everything fine?
Yes, sir.
Okay, fine. Let me share the presentation. So we were talking about this, what you call covalent bonding. So basically covalent bonding actually happens because of sharing of the electrons. And this sharing of electron is actually in such a way that it makes
Sir,
the
presentation is not visible.
आ रही है संदीप आ रही है ओके अभी आ गई होगी आ गया okay fine so this is because of sharing of the electrons, and that sharing of electron gives feeling to both the atoms which are sharing the electron as if their outermost shell is completely filled. For example, carbon, which has a deficiency of 4 electrons, when it shares all the 4 electrons with some nearby atoms like hydrogen, in that case, what will happen? That carbon will feel as if it has completed its outermost shell, and hydrogen will also feel as if it has completed its outermost shell. But overall there is a deficiency of single electron, isn't it? Because carbon needs one additional electron, hydrogen also needs one additional electron, but we are giving only one electron. Means to hydrogen, carbon is sharing its electron, and to carbon, hydrogen is sharing its electron. So that because of that, that particular electron is localized between the two atoms, and that leads to formation of covalent bond, which actually results in insulating or semiconducting compounds. Means the electrons are localized. Uh, we were discussing about the comparison of covalent bond with ionic bond. In case of ionic bond, basically the electron is completely transferred from one atom to the another one, which leads to the formation of ions, and those ions actually attract each other via Coulomb interaction, electrostatic Coulomb interaction. Whereas in covalent bond, there is no complete transfer, there is a sharing of the electrons. So because of that, there is no net charge developed on the atoms, and hence they bond to each other via sharing. So that shared electron acts like a kind of glue between two atoms, and that leads to formation of the bonds. And this is some X-ray diffraction pattern. I mean, sorry, not exactly X-ray diffraction pattern, but this is the charge density plots obtained from X-ray diffraction. So we have studied in our second unit that how X-ray diffraction is related to charge density, right? So once we know we do X-ray diffraction, we can find out charge density contours as well, or charge density distribution around the atoms. So in covalent bond, the great thing is you will see that, okay, this is the charge density profile. You will see that when you are close to the atoms, the value is low, but when you go exactly somewhere in between the two atoms, the charge density is highest. So this shows that there is some localization of electron somewhere here in between the two atoms, which indicates that there must be a covalent bond formation. So from charge density distribution as well, we can talk about nature of bonding among two atoms. So in case charge distribution or charge density is more around a particular atom, then we can say, okay, the bonding is ionic kind. And in case it is it is highest in between two atoms, then we will say that the bonding is predominantly covalent in nature. There is nothing like, there may be something like a mixture. Usually people define how much % of ionic character and then how much of covalent character. There can be, the bonding can be in between as well. So anyway, now the covalent bond has strong directional properties. This we were trying to talk yesterday as well. Because of what happens, that covalent bond is formed due to hybridization of the orbitals. In carbon, for example, 4 electrons are there. So one in s orbital, then 3p orbital. So sp3 hybridization happens. And because of this, we get 4 identical orbitals, which are sp3 hybridized. And those orbitals are such that they try to redistribute them among in the space in such a way that they are equally spaced from each other. Equally spaced means they try to uniformly redistribute so that overall energy of the system is minimum. In case any 2 orbitals are very close to each other, what will happen? There will be repulsion among the electron pairs, right? Or electrons in those orbitals. So the tendency remains of those orbitals to redistribute in such a way that they are maximum possible distance away from each other, and that leads to specific distribution of the orbitals in the space or around the atom. Because of this, these covalent bonds has a directional properties. Means, for example, in CH3, hydrogen carbon hydrogen bond angle is a specific value. Even in diamond, you would notice that there are only 4 nearest neighbors to each carbon atom, because that's because of sp3 hybridization. So there is a limited number of nearest neighbors, 4 nearest neighbors in case of diamond. So basically carbon, silicon, germanium, all has diamond kind of structure. We have studied diamond structure in our second unit in detail. So that's why we don't need to talk about it again. But yes, that's why germanium is shown here to illustrate the covalent bonding. So there is another characteristic associated with the covalent bonding that okay, this has tetrahedral angles. Even though this arrangement gives a low filling space, there is another characteristic of covalent bonds that filling space is low, means packing fraction is low. If you now there is another very interesting question here. You have studied, I think, in your maybe BSc, I think, because I didn't discuss it during my class on crystal structures, that packing fraction for FCC crystal structures happens to be something like 0.74, and HCP and FCC have same packing fraction, close to 0.74, means 74% of the volume of the unit cell is completely filled, right? And we have also studied that, okay, diamond actually has FCC lattice, isn't it? So if diamond has FCC lattice, means it comes under FCC structure, isn't it? FCC crystal structure. Still, diamond has a packing fraction of 0.34. How would you explain this, what you say, inconsistency of these statements? Can anyone help or try to do this? Why is it so? FCC, diamond is also FCC lattice, right? And other FCC structures like sodium exists in BCC, I think, but many metals like potassium, calcium, all those exists in FCC lattice or FCC structure. So their packing fraction is quite high, but it's not the case for diamond, which also has FCC lattice. Why is it so? Yes, anyone?
Sir, in diamond, carbon atoms are attached with the 4 carbon atoms. Means nearest neighbor of a carbon atom is 4. But for example, in sodium chloride, there are 12 nearest neighbors. That's why.
So the main thing here is that these Ankit says less dense. Yeah, that is clear. It is less dense. But why? So the thing is that 74% of packing fraction which we obtained, if you go back to those articles and try to search in maybe your BSc classes, then you will find out that packing fraction was obtained for spherical arrangement or FCC arrangement of spheres. And in case of monoatomic basis, means suppose there is only one atom in basis, so each lattice point equals one sphere. So in that case, if we try to calculate the packing fraction, that turns out to be very high, and which is something like 74%. But in case we have diatomic basis or polyatomic basis, now things depend upon how are the basis atoms bonded to each other. So in case of diamond, the basis atoms are restricted to bond to only 4 neighbors, 4 nearest neighbors, and they have strong directional properties as well. So because of this, what happens, a lot of space is left empty in the unit cell. So diamond structure, despite having FCC lattice, it doesn't have that high packing fraction. Means if packing fraction is low, then also you can say that this is the characteristic indicating towards covalent kind of bonding. Means there must be strong directional bonds which must be leading to small packing fraction or lot of empty space. Because if you talk of germanium, then there is an atom here, there is an atom here. Here everything is empty. So because of that directional characteristic, only 4 atoms will be bonded to this any particular germanium. So that's something interesting. In case of noble gases, there is nothing like a directional characteristic. They also has a high packing fraction because they also form HCP or HCC structures, and because of that, atoms behave just like atomic sphere, just like complete spheres, close to very close to being a sphere or spherical, and then they has a really high packing fraction because there is nothing like a directional characteristic. Okay, so that's what explains this low packing fraction. And tetrahedral bond allows only 4 nearest, that we already discussed. Okay, whereas in other, so close packed structure and FCC lattice, two are different now. We should not confuse ourselves. Close packed structures means FCC lattice or HCP lattice with 12 nearest neighbors, whereas FCC lattice or FCC lattice means face-centered cubic lattice. Then basis may be anything. I mean, that is not a closely packed structure necessarily. So each FCC lattice is not necessarily representing a close packed structure. I hope you are not getting confused. So if you have an FCC lattice and it consists of monoatomic bases, then most of the cases it will lead to closely packed crystal structures. For example, calcium, as I told you, most of your alkali metals, alkaline earth metals, they form FCC structures. So those are closely packed structures, close packed structures. Whereas, say diamond structure, it has FCC lattice, but it is not a close packed structure. So a lattice doesn't necessarily confirm that the structure is going to be a close packed structure. It depends upon what is the basis. I hope you are able to get it. Okay, Rahul says atomic radius is much less. It's not exactly related to atomic radius, but mainly it is because of the bonding characteristic. Okay. Now, okay, I mean, we noticed that, okay, carbon and silicon, as we saw here, carbon, silicon, germanium all have diamond kind of structure, means they form covalent bonding. But then having same kind of bonding doesn't mean that things will be similar. There's something really very interesting here in this statement. We should not overemphasize the similarity of the bonding in carbon and silicon, because carbon, although it has a tendency to form covalent bonds, it gives rise to the whole of the biology. I mean, you know, most of the biological systems, rather I would say all the biological systems has dominance of carbon in them, isn't it? But silicon gives rise to geology and semiconductor technology. So now here is something really very interesting. I mean, try to see how beautifully nature has designed things. Despite two atoms having similar tendency to form bonds, both forms covalent bonding, the two can give rise to distinct or widely distinct branches. Now you can see the whole biology comes from carbon. And now if you try to see the things, biological things around us, there is a vast variety of biological systems around us. And they have their own intriguing properties, own complex or interesting properties. And if you go on other side to the silicon, then you will see the whole IC industry, the semiconductor technology based mainly upon silicon. So now the two atoms being similar, but how they can give rise to a distinct branches, and both are really very interesting and very vast. So that's what we can say, the beauty of nature, that even by playing with the small thing. Now, what is the major difference between the two? I mean, carbon and silicon has difference in their atomic number, and although they are lying in the same group, okay, both have valency 4, they have valence electronic configuration same, but how the two can lead to entire different empire of properties. So that's really interesting, and that's how nature, so the nature can do a lot of miracles with the help of small changes. And that's what we all are learning actually, that how nature is capable of doing all these great things by just tuning the small things, by tweaking small things. So now here is just only the thing of two atoms, right? Carbon and silicon. Now imagine the periodic table and imagine the vast nature of the things around us. So now that's how nature is actually acting by doing very, very small changes and leading to very interesting differences in properties. Anyhow, that's something we can say uh, sort of okay, let's come to the next thing. So covalent bonds, I mean, binding of the molecular hydrogen is the simple example of the covalent bond. Figure 12, here is the figure 12. This is the figure 12. This all has been taken from Kittel. So you can refer to the details in Kittel. So there is another very interesting thing associated with the covalent bonds, that the energy of the bond is smaller, or we should say the bond is rather stronger in case the spin of the electrons forming covalent bond is antiparallel. This has been proven on the basis of many calculations as well. And main reason for this is actually the Pauli exclusion principle, right? Why so? We will be seeing this shortly. The binding depends on relative spin orientation, not because they are strong magnetic dipole forces. Of course, opposite spins will lead to additional magnetic forces, but that's not the main reason for this. The main cause is Pauli's exclusion principle. So this spin-dependent Coulomb energy is called exchange interaction. So I mean, this is the something which you will be doing maybe in your advanced level of courses. That I don't know whether you have done it when you study something like many body theory. There you come across these things in detail, exchange interaction and all. So here is this figure which has come from calculations based upon hydrogen molecule, H2 molecule. So one set of calculation has been done with the two electrons kept parallel to each other or forced to be parallel to each other. And that's the kind of energy this set of calculations give. Now you can see when these are far away from each other, this is interatomic separation. When the atoms are far away from each other, the energy is almost independent of their separation, which represents that atoms are not at all interacting very away from each other. When they try to come close to each other, what happens? Their energy keeps on increasing. Why? Because the spins are forced to become parallel to each other. And what happens because of that? The energy of the system will overall rise. So this second one is the classical calculation, means calculation done based upon the classical physics laws, right? So the third calculation is opposite spins. Classical means only we are considering the charge distribution. So there is small binding here, means energy going negative. There is a binding tendency, but it is small. Now, next one is because of the spins incorporated, and now the spins are anti-parallel to each other. So these anti-parallel spins leads to rather stronger binding, and this is representing sort of binding force, isn't it? Deeper is the potential well, stronger is the binding. So means this figure shows that when the spins are anti-parallel to each other, the covalent bond is strongest. So this is a charge density distribution in that case, you can see. So how these calculations were done in detail, that's entirely different issue, because that demands a lot of theoretical understanding. We are not doing that exactly here, but I'll be giving you a quick flavor of that in today's lecture. Don't worry. So now there's one common question we may ask, that, okay, why Pauli's principle gives a strong repulsion? Isn't it? That's a conceptual question anybody may ask you. Why is it so? Let's try to have a quick intuitive review or overview of that. So any system actually consists of many energy states, isn't it? So many energy levels. So if you take hydrogen molecule on any system, any atom which has multiple electrons as well, so there will be energy states, and electrons are actually sitting in specific energy states. But what does Pauli's exclusion principle say is that, okay, no more than 2 electrons can occupy in a particular energy state, right? So when you try to bring 2 atoms very close to each other, what will happen? That you are actually trying to push the electrons to a smaller and smaller volume, right? And because of this, what will happen? They will try to occupy the energy states in that small localized volume. But what Pauli's exclusion principle says that, okay, you can't have more than 2 electrons in this particular specific state. So what will happen? If you try to fill more electrons, they should go to next higher energy level or even higher energy levels. Now, if suppose, I'm not talking of degeneracy here much. This is just a quick qualitative understanding, and this is mainly mainly to give you the intuitive sense of how Pauli's exclusion principle gives rise to energy. So what will happen now? Electrons are added to the next higher energy level, and this keeps on going to the higher end, because Pauli's exclusion principle forbids more than 2 electrons to go to same energy level. So what will happen if you are trying to pack more and more electron in small volume? They will actually try to go to higher and higher energy level. So what will happen because of this? Energy of the system will rise. Why? Because if you calculate the total energy of the system, it is N1 E1 plus N2 E2 plus N3 E3 and so on, right? So if there are N1 electrons in E1 energy level, this will give this much energy. Then the electrons will go to higher energy level because of Pauli's exclusion principle. So energy will rise. Now E2 is higher than E1. So what will happen? The energy will be rising suddenly, right? Because up to some level, electrons must be going to the same energy level. What will happen? Then energy will increase, but not that rapidly. But when we try to compress atoms very close to each other, what will happen? Electrons will try to go to the higher energy levels because of that strong compression. And that will actually force the electrons, due to Pauli's exclusion principle, to go to higher energy levels. And that will increase the energy tremendously and further higher and higher. And that is the kind of thing which leads to very strong rise in energy. Now, in case you force the spins to be parallel, not anti-parallel. So what will happen? There won't be 2 electrons here, rather. If you put additional constraint that spins has to be parallel, then these 6 electrons won't be arranged in these 3 energy levels. Rather, they should go to 6 energy levels. So what will be the energy in that case? 1 into E1, then E2 plus E3 plus E4 plus E5 plus E6. That is going to be higher than 2 into E1 plus 2 into E2 plus 2 into E3, right? So that's how these kind of constraints leads to strong or sudden rise in energy because of Pauli's exclusion principle. Is this clear, or any question from this? I mean, could you understand the mechanism?
Yes, sir.
Okay, anyone else? Is it okay for everyone? Well, good. If no questions, then let's move ahead. Now that's about covalent bonding. We won't be doing that much now. That's a quick idea of what a covalent bonding is and what are the basic features of covalent bonds. And now we will be talking about another set of bonding, which is metallic bonding. So basically, metallic bonding is formed in most of the metallic crystals, like alkali metals. In them, they form metallic bonds. For example, sodium atom, not sodium atom, sodium solid. So one thing is sodium chloride. That's a different thing. That's a ionic bonding. Okay. But if we talk of sodium solid, means all atoms of sodium bonding together, forming sodium crystal, sodium solid. I think that comes into BCC structure. Need to check. I think it is BCC. So that kind. Now the question is, what causes that bonding force in case of these metals? Just a minute. Let me check if I'm not giving you a wrong thing. Sodium crystal structure. Anyone is aware of what is the crystal structure of sodium? Yes, anyone? What is the crystal structure of sodium? You know, this kind of small questions can come, and then you may have to.
BCC, sir.
Sure?
Yes, sir.
Okay, yeah, I remembered it is BCC, but I had done it very long back. I mean, I had seen it long back. So maybe I had confusion. So this is BCC, okay? So now the question is, what holds those sodium atoms together. Thing is, BCC, and most of the alkali metals indeed actually forms FCC structure. And FCC structure means these are closely packed structures. Sodium is a sort of what you can call distinction. Otherwise, most of the alkali metals have their crystal structure, which is FCC. You can notice, you can check it in any book or on internet even. So now the question is, what leads to that kind of packing? So basically that is because of the valence electrons. So all the alkali metals have their tendency to lose their external additional electron, and that additional electron, by getting rid of that additional electron, these atoms can get that noble gas configuration. So due to this, what happens when we form sodium metal? So sodium atoms are hardly bothered about those additional electrons, and those are loosely bound to the nucleus, and they can roam around here and there in the solid. And that loosely bound electrons to that specific nucleus leads to strong metallic bonding. It's reasonably strong, not as strong as covalent bonds, but reasonably strong bonding. So the bonding because of free electrons actually is what is called a metallic bonding. So there is another, distinguishing feature of these metallic crystals is that, as the name indicates, they are metals. Means they have freely moving valence electrons, and that leads to the conduction process easily. That leads to easy conduction process, and these materials are very good conductors, metals rather. And means the electrons in these materials or in these metallic bonds are delocalized. They are not localized. So now in covalent bonds, you will say, okay, we have the valence electrons of the atoms, they are shared by two atoms, isn't it? And then what is the difference between metallic bond and covalent bonds? So basically in covalent bonds, the two electrons or the electrons are shared among only two atoms. Whereas in metallic bond, they are not shared among only two, but they are freely shared among all the atoms. The electrons can freely roam around from here to there. So that's the defining or differentiating feature, that in metallic bonding, the electrons are delocalized. They can move anywhere in the metal, and that's what leads to the conduction process or them to be good conductors. Whereas in covalent bonds, these are localized. They are forcefully bound by two atoms in between the two atoms, exactly in between the two atoms. So those are localized electrons. So in covalent crystals, the electrons are localized. In metallic crystals, the electrons are delocalized. So these are two very distinguishing features among the two. In some metals, the interaction of ion cores with the conduction electron always makes large contribution to the binding energy. But the characteristic feature of the metallic bonding is lowering the energy of the valence electrons in the metal. So what happens? Why do they redistribute those electrons? There is another thing, that by redistributing those electrons or freely moving electrons, their energy also lowers a little bit, and that additional lowering of energy leads to the binding force or metallic bonding. Okay. The binding energy of alkali metal crystals is considerably less than alkali halides. Again, the same thing. Here is a comparison between metallic and ionic bonds. The binding energy of alkali metal crystals is considerably less than alkyl halide crystals. So this shows that the bond formed by the conduction electron is not very, very strong, but it is stronger than, of course, the sort of what you can call the van der Waals interaction, right? But of course, not as strong as the ionic or covalent bonds, because you can see that many alkali metals, you can cut them with the simple knife even. So that shows that the bonding is not that strong. The interatomic distances are relatively larger in alkali metals because the kinetic energy of the conduction electron is lower at larger interatomic distances. In ionic crystals, they would like to pack closer to each other because of ionic forces, but in case of metals, the interatomic distances are relatively larger. So these are also the defining features of metallic bonding. So these are, I mean, here we are discussing what are the characteristic feature of each bonding. If you have done some characterization, for example, XRD or some other characterization, then if you have to talk on the nature of bonding a particular material must be having, then you will look at all these features. And then according to that, you can try to say indirectly that, okay, this must be the kind of bonding in those crystals. Okay. So the metals tends to crystallize in relatively close packed structures. As I already told you, HCP, FCC, BCC. FCC and HCP are have higher packing fraction, but BCC also doesn't have lower. It is also having, I think, very high, reasonably higher packing fraction, something like 68% or so. You can go back again to your BSc books and try to see what was the packing fraction for BCC structure. And there is nothing like a directionality in that case. There is no directional characteristic as it is associated in covalent case. Okay. So that is why these closely packed structures are formed only in case where there is no direction dependent preferences of the atoms. So in metallic bond as well, there is no such restriction, and that is why they form closely packed structures. And there is another thing, because of this metallic bonds, these metals have all those characteristics like malleability, metallic luster, and all that. Malleability, why they are malleable? We can form wires and sheets because you know, the electrons are freely roaming around. So the metals doesn't crack easily, right? So why? Because you try to take the crystal, try to mold it in one or the other way, what will happen? Electrons will accordingly redistribute, right? So there is, I mean, this kind of tendencies leads to the formation of these kind of characteristics like malleability, metallic luster, etc., etc. So these are the characteristics of the metallic crystals. Now let us talk a little, just a flavor of how we can understand those metallic bonds, or indeed any kind of bonding, or how to indeed understand a material in general. So basically, to understand theoretically the microscopic character of what is happening in the various bondings, we actually need to apply the quantum mechanics, because those are quantum mechanical systems. We are talking at the atomistic length scales, and the de Broglie wavelengths of the particles involved, that is electrons, are of the order of interparticle separation, and that's the condition where we must actually go for quantum mechanical treatment of the system. So basically, what one has to do, one has to apply Schrodinger equation. That's how the Schrodinger equation looks like. And if you try to see this for materials, then that is actually a many-body problem. Any material is basically made up of multiple atoms. So those atoms are arranged in some specific structures, and based upon that, we have to actually write down the Hamiltonian for the whole system. If you take a unit cell, for example, which has n atoms, then you may actually you need to write down the Hamiltonian, and where you will be having kinetic energy of the electrons. So if there are total n electrons, suppose, not n atoms, if there are total n electrons in the system, we need to write down the total kinetic energy operator. This part writes down the interaction of the electrons with the nuclei, isn't it? I mean, this Ze is the charge on, say, each nucleus sitting in the whole lattice. Then capital R actually represents the coordinates of the particular nucleus. So this is representing interaction of a particular electron at some point, say I, Ri, with all the nuclei. So this summation is actually saying that, okay, one electron is interacting with this nearest nuclei, next to next nearest nuclei, next to next nearest nuclei, and so on. Means this is representing interaction of electron with all the nuclei, or this is actually representing electron nuclei interaction. And this is actually the term which is representing interaction of a particular electron with all other neighboring electrons. So indeed, to understand the full quantum mechanics of a material, you have to be in a position to solve this complex Schrodinger equation. Now try to see the Hamiltonian. It's really complex. And okay, I mean, this is a little more detail. So this is kinetic energy, same thing. This is periodic arrangement of nuclei. We are mainly now talking about crystalline materials. So nuclei are arranged in some structure. This is kinetic energy part. This is electron nuclei interaction energy. This is electron potential energy. So now try to imagine the Schrodinger equation, solving Schrodinger equation. It's not an easy task. When you had done it for simple cases like particle in a box, that try to move ahead and try to consider the case of something like hydrogen atom, then you can imagine that what was the complexity of the problem. You had to incorporate a lot of special techniques of mathematical physics, and many special functions were recalled, and then that is how we solved the hydrogen problem. Now try to imagine the case here. Hydrogen problem was very simple in that reference, in this context, if I try to compare that with this. So now here we have a Hamiltonian, which is containing so many terms, n. So typically, what is the number of electrons in a material? We have a large number of electrons of the order of Avogadro's number, right? So this term has something like Avogadro's number of operators sitting here. Similarly, Avogadro's number of atoms as well, isn't it? If you take 1 mole of sodium atoms, then that is something like 10 to the power 23 number of sodium atoms. So this term is also very large. This electron-electron interaction is very complex, another complex thing. And this term is specifically challenging. Why challenging? Because, uncertainty principle, conceptually, let us talk. So if you have to describe actually this term, you need to actually be in a position to tell the coordinates of the ith and jth electron, isn't it? But can we really localize the electron, or can we tell where a particular electron is sitting? No, uncertainty principle doesn't allow us. So that's where the additional challenge comes, right? We can't tell exactly where is ith electron and where is jth electron. Then means we can't tell exactly where is this, what is the potential among these two electrons, right? So if we can't tell about potential, we can't have exact Hamiltonian. And that's where we need a lot of approximation business. But that's not the context, or I mean, it's not the right course now to do all these things in detail. But at least you would realize that why I didn't teach you the details, how those curves were coming, how many things we didn't discuss. We didn't talk about, we only talked about van der Waal interaction, attractive part, not repulsive part, isn't it? And we didn't talk about covalent bonding, the theory of covalent bonding in detail, because all that demands such a kind of complex quantum mechanics, and that's beyond the scope of this course. But yes, we studied about certain basic characteristics of those bondings. But in case you will do some course on a many-body physics, where you will be learning, so most of the courses in condensed matter physics which are related to many-body physics is actually focusing on this term. How can we solve a many electron problem? Okay, so okay, let me show a very quick theory. One such theory was free electron theory, which was developed by Sommerfeld. We will be doing this in our next unit actually, but here is just a quick overview of this. So free electron theory is what? It says that let us remove all the interactions. Let us get rid of interaction of electrons with all the nuclei in the solid. Let us even remove the interaction of electrons with all the other electrons in the solid. Then solve the Schrodinger equation. And that is what is called the free electron theory. Now you will say, oh, is it so? Then why we actually, means we are getting rid of all the interactions which actually electron is facing in a material. then this theory is really useless. I mean, we are removing all the physical things, isn't it? Yeah, of course. But then in some contexts, some cases it works really well, specifically in cases like alkali metals. They behave more or less like the materials within free electron theory. And that was developed by Sommerfeld. But then more refined theories are required to understand things in more detail. That is why these are just the trivial examples of condensed matter physics. I mean, okay, let us do free electron theory, or let us do tight binding approximation. And these are two extreme examples. Free electron theory, we assume electrons to be totally free, no interaction at all. And these are, so this is the Schrodinger equation, which becomes for free electron case. This is some constant energy, say energy of, say, conduction band. This is fixed value. So there is no interaction part here. So this is what is solved. We'll do it. Then that's kind of energy versus wave vector dependence you find out, E versus K dependence. And then based upon that, we can solve many properties. But the main thing is that free electron theory is actually very oversimplification of a very complex problem. Then people try to solve more better theories, or try to solve this problem in more better way, like nearly free electron theory, nearly free electron approximation. Then this one, what you call Kronig-Penney model. I hope you have done it in your lower classes. So that Kronig-Penney model, all those things were refinement to this. Our objective was actually come as close to this Hamiltonian as we can. And that's a whole full course actually in itself. So I just put it as a flavor here that, okay, what is free electron theory and how is it related to general problem of material science? Okay. Well, so leaving that complexity here itself, quick another thing is hydrogen bonds. Those are also special kind of bonds. Rather, why this is a fifth kind of bond is because these are the bonds associated with only hydrogen. Only one atom in the periodic table have this tendency to form hydrogen bonding. So basically, many biological systems, water, DNA, many cases, hydrogen bonding plays a very crucial role, very important role. Main message of the story is that hydrogen being very, very small in size, it is like one proton, right? So it's a kind of ionic bond, but not exactly, we can't say it is just an ionic bond, because hydrogen is very, very small. So because of this, what happens? And it is formed between highly electronegative atoms and hydrogen. I mean, highly electronegative atoms try to possess additional attractive interaction for each other only when there is some hydrogen sitting in between them. That's called the hydrogen bonding. And it is just 3-atom bond, means one atom, second atom, third atom is hydrogen. So other atoms can't come close like this to form this. Like in hydrogen, in water, hydrogen bonding is formed between 2 oxygen atoms. So the similar kind of figure can be used to understand this. So you have some hydrogen atom, very small size. These are some negatively charged ions, highly electronegative. So there is a hydrogen atom is nothing but a positively charged nucleus. Of course, some electron is there. That electron may be transferred to these atoms or something like this. Then this positively charged region will have a tendency to attract these two, but these two will also have a tendency to repel each other, isn't it? But in case hydrogen were absent, they would have repelled each other very strongly. But this hydrogen acts as a kind of attraction center for them, and that's what leads to the formation of hydrogen bonding. This is very simple. I mean, so mainly it can be seen to be something like ionic bonding, but not strictly the ionic kind of case, because it's mainly because of this small size hydrogen atom which is responsible for this bonding. And yes, if you try to see it in terms of attractive forces, then Coulomb interactions are responsible for this. Coulomb interaction is responsible for this. Well, so I think atomic radii, this is a very small topic, but it needs somewhat more time. I mean, rather the time which we don't have today. So that's why I will skip this topic for next class. And well, that's all for today. Quickly, first mark your attendance. And meanwhile, if there is a question, you ask the question so that I can try to come up with the answer to your question. And don't leave the meeting. I have some assignments coming for you.